Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he saw the new card called Live or Die and will always choose to say the name of that card like Eddie Izzard asks cake or death. It's Matt Morgan.
So, Joey, you may not know this about me, but when I was younger, I had a job at a calendar factory and I got fired from that job, and all I did was take a day off. I thought it was a rather weak argument, though, so I don't know.
That explains the leap years. Matt, are you responsible for the leap years? Mystery solved.
That could be. It's totally not science. It's 100% Matt Morgan why we have leap years.
For sure. All right, up next, he doesn't choose live or die. He wakes up and chooses violence. It's Dana Roach.
Someone actually pointed out to me the other day that Matt tells an awful lot of dad jokes for someone who isn't actually a dad, and that seems like a pretty huge faux pas.
The faux pas.
You know, Joey, I've actually used this joke before, so shout out to you, Dana, for sniping my jokes. It's fine.
But once every other month, I take one that you've done before and don't even realize
it's true. It's true.
Just to see whether he'll notice it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I feel like the faux pas and the when it becomes apparent are like the dad jokes.
Yes.
the most meta of dad jokes. But we're not just here to talk about dad jokes. We're also here to talk about data. And well, this week, Matt, we're talking about something else too now, aren't we?
We certainly are. So for those of you who've been living under a rock, there have been a lot of changes to Commander as a format. And one of them that I'm sure is going to change is the current iteration of the Commander ban list. So what does that look like? We're going to take some thoughts down and share them all with you here.
Yeah, if Wizards of the Coast is about to reevaluate the ban list, then I suppose we should too. And that is going to be the subject for today. We've got a couple of things to do before we get into our main topic, though.
First off, we are very excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. We were in Baltimore a few weeks back for a work trip, and I actually watched Matt, completely unprompted, give a pitch for Ultimate Guard's Vago backpack to a friend of ours, like he was doing a commercial, just because he actually likes the backpack so much. That's a thing that I witnessed him doing just because he likes the product. That's how much we appreciate the things they do.
That is a true endorsement right there. I like the backpack enough to tell people offline and for free that it's actually a pretty cool backpack. And the sleeves, the deck boxes are great too. It's just, if you need an all-in-one solution, Ultimate Guard is the best way to protect all of your cards.
100%.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you happen to be at the MagicCon in Las Vegas at the end of this month, we will all be there. And if you happen to be there on Sunday and you want to wander over to the Mana stage at about noon 30, there's a possibility you'll see me with a bunch of other creators doing something pretty fun, pretty silly. Hope to see you there.
And if you'd like to support the show, there's a ton of ways you can support us. Leaving a review, subscribing on YouTube, word of mouth, it helps us so much more than we can say here. But if you would like to support us financially, you can do so over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see all these episodes a day early, there's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the coveted patron shout out. So this week we are going to give a very special shout out to Tyler Close, who wasn't a close call, you might say. So Tyler, thank you so much. And shout outs to your mom, Glenn Close, fantastic actor. Thank you so much for 101 Dalmatians and all those classics too. Wow. I was a Disney kid, could you tell?
Yeah, we can tell.
But either way, thank you, Tyler, for all the support. We appreciate it. And all of you patrons out there, you're the reason that we're here.
100%. Okay, guys, let's get into our main topic now. We're reevaluating the Commander banned list because, as we all know now, Wizards is in control of the Commander format here. We've had past episodes about all of that and how that went down. This is the reality that we're in, and Wizards of the Coast has said they're not planning on making any bans to new cards anytime soon, but they will be reevaluating the ban list to see if anything can come off of that list. So it feels incumbent upon us to discuss the current ban list, how we feel about it, and which cards we think they might be looking at, which cards we ourselves might have on watch lists, stuff like that. I don't know. Dana, where do you think we ought to start here?
I guess the first place to start is a question that I've seen crop up a few times in different places the last, several weeks. Why is a ban list necessary in the first place? And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that. Like, Matt, why is a ban list necessary here?
Well, I mean, when people talk about the ban list, they immediately say, well, my play group doesn't need a ban list. We have our own house rules. And that's great. That means you have a fantastic play group that you have that social relationship in place with, and you don't need the ban list. But also, the ban list, as the rules committee said so many times, and Wizards of the Coast kind of reiterated, the ban list isn't designed for those play groups. The ban list was designed to protect people's experiences in the wild playing with strangers. And that's what the ban list has been targeted for. And so if, again, you have that play group that say Joey, you, Dana, and I, all three of us have a play group with another friend, and we've just been house ruling things for years, we don't need the ban list. We can keep playing Magic the exact same way that we always have. But the ban list is to protect Timmy and Johnny out there when they go to MagicCon Las Vegas, and they're going to start playing with strangers, and they just want to know what kind of base level experience they're going to get. That is what the ban list is in place for.
I mean, it's a little bit similar to like if you are getting together with your friends to play basketball after work or something. You guys don't have to sit there and go over the rules of the game you're playing, how are you calling fouls? How rough are you going to be? Because you're playing with your friends and there's kind of an understanding of the game you want to play. Versus if you're playing in like a rec league at the YMCA, there are specific rules that are being put down because you're playing with strangers and there isn't like an established baseline for what you guys are going to be doing. It's just very similar to that, I think.
Yeah, 100%. You need a starting point. You need to know that this format is 100 cards. You start with 40 life, what commander damage is, that it's a singleton format. You need a place to begin every conversation, and a ban list is just an extension of those already pre-existing rules, because it seems like kind of a disaster to start every pre-game conversation with, so are we playing Black Lotus?
Right.
That seems like maybe not the best starting point. No ban list ever would mean that you were constantly having to change the conversation every time that you sit down. Every time they print more hull breachers, that conversation would get more complicated than it already is. So I think we all agree that a ban list of some kind does need to exist.
Yeah, a baseline definitely needs to be there just so that folks playing with strangers, and that's a feature of the ban list that I think a lot of players who are more entrenched, the people who are watching this video, for example, you are more invested in the game than the people that this is advocating for because you know the game well enough to come to listen to content about it. But people who don't, people who are still buying their packs at Walmart and Amazon, stuff like that, those are the people that the ban list, the rules committee, and the kind of philosophy document, and now WotC are trying to protect. They're trying to save that experience. It kind of advocates for people who are newer to the game, who don't know how to advocate for themselves quite yet.
The reason that I think why is a ban list even necessary ends up being a part of the conversation is because I think a lot of people look at it and say that's an inconsistent list. Some of this doesn't feel right. Some of this logically appears inconsistent, which is fair. I just don't think that's a reason to do away with the concept of a ban list entirely. And I think it is illuminating to look over past reasons that the Commander Rules Committee that existed prior was trying to illuminate why certain cards make it onto the list. That the goal of the ban list is not trying to regulate competitive play, and even power level can be best left to individual play groups, but instead they say that it seeks to demonstrate which cards threaten the positive player experience that is at the core of the format or that prevents players from reasonable levels of self-expression. The primary focus of the list is on cards that are problematic because of their extreme consistency, ubiquity, or their ability to restrict others' opportunities. And they don't use any single rule to establish a ban, but there are often a lot of factors. Frankly, a lot of it comes down to vibes. And doing a vibe check every single time that you play a game, having a ban list helps with the vibe check.
Yeah, that was something that on a recent episode discussing bans and everything that had been happening, Rachel on the Command Zone had said, Commander, we're not about power levels, we're about vibes here.
Yeah, very much. And so I think it's important to say, okay, if we are reevaluating the ban list, if we're looking at all of this from scratch, why do we even have one? We agree that we need one. Then it comes down to, all right, what stays on it?
So you can kind of group a lot of the cards up into rough categories that explain why everything in that category is banned. So maybe we'll start going over a few of those. In the first one, and the easiest one to talk about, are the anti-cards. Early on in the game, the way it was designed, you played for a card. A random card was selected from each of your decks, and the winner of the game won the other person's card. I'm not sure if anyone actually ever did that, but that was one of the intents of the game very early on. And as a result, there were actual cards that did things that impacted the ante. And all of those cards are banned. And they were really only around for the first, iteration of Magic in the first expansion, or 3, I think. But none of those are legal in Commander.
Yeah, I want to play Magic the Gathering. I don't want to play Pogs. That went out in the 90s, whereas Magic came in during the 90s. And so anti-cards are staying out of the format forever. Same with manual dexterity things.
Right, yeah. Cards like Falling Star, Chaos Orb, those are also banned because we don't need to judge our gameplay by how well we flip cards onto the field. Let's just play the actual card game itself. That allows us to focus. I think a lot of these are feeling very obvious. And there's also one other category that I think is very obvious too. Those are the cards that interact poorly with the structure of the format. Trade Secrets and Lutri are big flag bearers for these examples. With the current structure, Lutri being a free 101st card in any red-blue plus deck, that's not entirely fair. I know it's a cute otter, but it's not the kind of thing that would really be supported by the current rule system. Some outside the game stuff as well. Conspiracies, there's kind of a blanket ban on those. There are a couple of cards that were removed from all constructed formats for we've gotten better reasons as well. From starting principles of if there's going to be a ban list, these are some pretty easy bases to fill up.
Yeah, and they're probably not going to be ones that WotC even attempts to revisit.
Right.
Yeah, I think another category that they're probably not going to revisit either is just cards that have been banned because of barrier to entry problems for multiple reasons, but restrictive price. I think a lot of the cards that fall into this category, the original Power 9, Ancestral Recall, Black Lotus, the Moxen, those types of cards where there's so few out there that if you make them legal, they get ludicrously more expensive and they're already prohibitively priced. I don't think that Library of Alexandria is ever going to come back either just because of the price factor. And yeah, anything in this category, I really struggle to see coming back.
So Matt, I agree, but I think this is probably the most interesting category of banned cards now that Wizards as a company is controlling the Commander format. Because Wizards they have a lot of difficulty acknowledging card prices on the secondary market. That gets them into a lot of legal hot water, so they try not to mention it at all. So I agree with you. I don't think these cards are being touched. I don't think the game is better with any of them, but it will be interesting to see how Wizards navigates that, because if the previous justification for cards like Ancestral Recall being banned is because we don't want to create a perceived barrier of entry that you're supposed to spend thousands of dollars on cards to play this game, which is a good reason, but how does Wizards acknowledge that? I'm not entirely sure, and it strikes me as we just don't touch it with a 10-foot pole on their end. So those, I think, as categories all make a lot of sense and doesn't tend to be where a lot of the conversation would end up being. I think there are some other categories with a lot more interesting cards that are going to get much more scrutiny from Wizards of the Coast.
Well, should we dig into this a little bit and talk about some cards that we could conceivably see WotC unbanned? We're not necessarily advocating for their unbanning. At least I don't intend on doing so. I think everything on the ban list should stay in the ban list. But ones that we could see Wizards of the Coast making decisions about.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that clear, Dana. We will advocate specifically if we have a position, we will say this is our position. These are things that we are hypothesizing could be there. And I think the remaining three categories, the three groupings of why certain cards are banned, are the ones that are the most interesting to people and to Wizards itself. There are cards that cause massive game delays or that create loss of agency. I think limited resources is a very big example of that, destroying a bunch of lands and preventing people from playing any further lands. There are some cards that get you way too far ahead. They're kind of the best in class cards that reduce your deck diversity. An example of this might be, I don't know, Grizzlebrand. That is the thing I would reanimate all the time if I could. And then also some cards that create disappointing twists to the end of the game. And I think Coalition Victory is a big example that a lot of people are probably talking about that. So those are some remaining categories that I think will draw the most amount of scrutiny from people. Assuming that you're on the Wizards of the Coast new Commander panel, what are the cards that you think are being looked at most in that type of hypothetical? Are there any specific cards that leap to mind that you think are first and foremost in that types of Wizards conversation?
So I think actually there's a world where Trade Secrets has more conversations, but it does open the door at the higher power level tables where it is definitely gets abused in a way that got it banned originally. I do think that it's kind of a Protean Hulk type of situation where there is potential at the lower power tables, but it also, I think that kind of creates a schism between the competitive players and the tournament players of Commander versus the social players. And I think for that reason, it should stay banned. But I think that there's in the multiverse, there is one where Trade Secrets is unbanned.
The one thing that's kind of weird about a lot of these too, because there's a handful of cards that I could conceivably see them unbanning. But when it was just the rules committee making these decisions, I never really thought too much about the financial implications of doing so. And the reality is, with Wizards making the decisions, we have to look at that. Look at the situation. Could this card be unbanned? Not only because it's maybe not that much of a problem, but because it could potentially make them money. as being a chase card in a set, because I think that's a motivating factor. The problem I found when I was going over the list was the cards that felt like they could conceivably be the safest to unban that one could make a case for were also cards that didn't seem like there was a financial incentive to unban. I assume there would be one or two that had this sweet spot where like, oh, if they unban this, it could assume the role of a mana crypt in terms of be an expensive card that could get reprinted in a set that would make people want to crack packs. I didn't find anything that hit those criteria. I don't know if did you guys find anything that like seemed like it would fall into that sweet spot?
I think that there's a couple that they could unban for the sake of being able to reprint them. So obviously that rules out anything on the reserve list. Stuff like Recurring Nightmare. I would love to play Recurring Nightmare. Whenever I get to play Vintage Cube, it is immediately one of the cards that I will pack one, pick one. I love playing with it. That said, it should never be legal because if it did get legalized in Commander, the price would go absolutely nutso. So I think anything on the reserve list automatically, I mean, there's probably a world where you could argue that Refellos is something that could be unbanned. Refellos Llanowar Emissary, it's an old card from Urza's Destiny, and it's a 2/1 for 2, but it says tap to add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each forest you control. That has a huge potential to generate a ton of mana fairly early on in the game. So I can see why it was banned originally. But I think power level wise, Kin and Bonder Prodigy does something very similar that gives you access to more colors, affects everything too. So you're able to generate a ton of mana every turn. So on a power level basis, I don't think Refellos Llanowar Emissary is all that different than a Kinnan type of deck. That said, there's no reprint equity by unbanning Refellos. I think that you can probably keep that on the list of cards that won't be unbanned because of that reason. There's no real reason, there's no motivation for Wizards of the Coast to unban that because they can't make any money off of that.
I do think the problem with Refellos isn't that it makes a ton of mana on turn 3, it's that it makes a ton of mana on turn 2. That's the issue there versus like Kinnan's probably better once you get to a couple turns under your belt. Same with Selvala. It's the turn 1 or 2 issue there. Although without things like Jeweled Lotus, maybe that becomes a little bit less of an issue and it becomes safer. But like you said, it doesn't fix anything. You just added one more super potentially problematic commander to the pool and gained nothing in terms of packs you've sold.
Yep. Anything on the reserve list, automatically not on the table.
Sway of the Stars is one that Dana, I know you and I have talked about before. It does a big reset. It's like it's 10 mana and it has everyone shuffle up, everyone's life total becomes 7 and you've got 7 more cards in your hand. That one's just annoying. It's just annoying. I think it has kind of the Worldfire problem, but I think Worldfire proved itself to be a safe unban.
But Worldfire was unbanned, yeah.
Yeah.
And it only shows up currently in 8,326 total decks. And
it's entirely possible Sway the Stars is the safest unban because I don't know if many people would even run it.
And that's it for me. I think
not that it's not strong, just I think people wouldn't bother.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to bring it up here. I personally think it would probably go the way of Worldfire. I think it's a disappointing way for a game to go. I don't want to experience a Sway of the Stars any more than I want to experience a Scrambleverse.
Yeah.
But those things do seem to self-regulate. And so they read to me as a card that like would be safe because I think even though the effect that the card has on the game is undesirable, I think the card itself would also be kind of undesirable. Frankly, I could even see them unbanning something like Gifts Ungiven. That's a very powerful tutor, but I could imagine them unbanning it because they might hope that their new bracket system is successful enough to help regulate where Gifts Ungiven would see play and keep it out of games where it would be more of an issue. Just throwing it out there.
Gifts Ungiven, I'm sure that they would like to see unbanned. It's not an expensive card necessarily, but I think that, again, there's worlds where that exists. And I've said many times, I would absolutely love if Primeval Titan were unbanned for this reason. Yes, it's incredible with the amount of resource generation that can get, but also it becomes a Chase Mythic pretty quickly. And I think players have kind of started to speculate on that a little bit. If you look at the price of Primeval Titan lately, it has skyrocketed. It's gone up 5x for some of the printings in the past couple weeks.
I actually, to your point, Dana, I think there are several cards that they could turn into chase cards. Gifts Ungiven could be an example. I actually think Emrakul is the kind of thing that they've put on marketing material before. That's the kind of thing that sells packs. Matt, you just named Primeval Titan. I am firmly opposed to a Primeval Titan unban. Sure. I really hope they don't do that.
Same here.
But more to your question, in my opinion, the thing that Wizards may do here is I don't think that they're entirely happy that something like Jeweled Lotus was just banned.
Right.
Even though they've admitted that Jeweled Lotus is a design mistake, I think it's the kind of thing that very clearly has been used to sell packs.
Yeah.
My guess is that what they do is try to unban like 3 things, one of which ends up being a Jeweled Lotus or a Mana Crypt-esque card that was just banned, that they're like, yeah, but we want that reprint equity back. Potentially Wizards higher-ups, Hasbro higher-ups to be perfectly honest, might want that. They might want that reprint equity. Jeweled Lotus is such a commander-y card. So of the cards that were just recently banned, if one of them were to become unbanned, my personal bet is on Jeweled Lotus. I wonder whether they would unban Mana Crypt. It's possible. While they have paid a lot of attention to Dockside and given it premium printings and reprints and stuff in the past, I think Dockside has proven its sins a little bit more than the others have. I think one of those things is a stronger battle for Wizards to fight than the other would be. And this feels like kind of their only chance to do it. I think if it stays banned, if any Jeweled Lotus or Mana Crypt, if they stay banned now, I think they stay banned forever. Right. And if they do it as a grouping of unbans, I don't know, it just seems like kind of the cleanest execution for them to get away with that. It would be conspicuous if it were to be unbanned solo, for instance. Even if some of the other cards that may become unbanned or not, even if those aren't the chase cards themselves, say they unban Sway of the Stars or something like that, that might not turn into a chase card. But if it is grouped with an unban of Jeweled Lotus, that's what has the monetary incentive for it. And I think that I think that has to be a big part of the discussion.
So if I'm in that conversation and I'm told, hey, we want to unban, say, Jeweled Lotus, and we need 1 or 2 more other unbans, what ones could you rationalize in there? There's a couple I think I could. Panoptic Mirror would be one. It costs 5 mana, and you imprint a sorcery spell or instant spell on it with converted mana cost X or less by tapping Panoptic Mirror and spending X mana. The reason it's banned primarily is because people would just put extra turn spells underneath it and cast a Time Warp and then move to their next turn and cast Time Warp. And like it's just, if you have an extra turn spell, it's a win. However, it's also 5 mana, and the extra turn spells are 5 mana, and you have to have this in your hand, and you have to have the Time Warp or whatever it is in your hand. There's a lot of things for 10 mana requiring 2 cards that win you the game. I don't particularly like it, but like, don't know if that's any more egregious than any other 10 mana 2 card win conditions, of which there are several in the game.
I could see this one being heavily discussed. I think even the, quote, fail state of this card, where, like, the only thing that you're putting it under it isn't even an extra turn spell, but also, like, even putting a Wrath under this thing is also, leads to such a miserable, repetitive play pattern. I could see it, Dana. I agree with you that this might be something that could be discussed. I really hope it don't, though, because I think even the less offensive version of this card is still leads to games that are like, ugh.
Well, and it was funny, too, looking up at old Star City Games articles where Sheldon was talking about the initial ban lists and the old watch list that they did have internally too. They talked about how they didn't want Crucible of Worlds to be legal, and it was on a watch list and it was banned for a little bit because they didn't want it to loop it with Strip Mine. And even then, I could see people, the best case scenario, putting Stone Rain, putting Manwolvi, Acid Moss, those types of cards under it, and then just buying yourself time until you get to the really egregious cards. It just creates so many play patterns. I see why people would have that conversation and kind of well, how bad does this really get? I do think that the how bad does this really get answer is pretty bad, though.
I agreed. I'm just like looking for cards. Don't get me wrong. Again, these aren't ones I like, but I think if you had to advocate for one, this is one of the least offensive options, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm Wizards of the Coast, and I'm looking for a card, like we talked about a little bit ago, we're looking for a way to create these marquee reprint opportunities. I think Primeval Titan is probably the least overall damaging. And that's not to say it's not doing damage by coming back. It's going to impact a lot of games. I have decks that would make a huge impact and abuse this. But I also think that looking at other options, if we had to unban anything in a format about resource accumulation, this just does that at the best way. But it's also not taking away resources. I think people look at Primeval Titan and compare it to Sylvan Primordial. I definitely do. And in Sylvan Primordial, because it's destroying other people's lands, that 100% is creating game states that I don't want to be repeated. I think that they're similar, sure, but Primeval Titan, I think you create a marquee reprint. It's going to be a mythic. It's not going to be around in a ton of games. It's just going to be something that shows up again. But I would rather see a Primeval Titan than a Sylvan Primordial. And I think that's the card that if I were on WotC's team, that's the card I would be targeting right now.
So I agree with you also here that Primeval Titan is probably one of the bigger things in discussion. It certainly has been in bigger discussion online. A lot of the things that you just named, though, are some of the reasons why I think it really must stay banned. Like, if I'm on that panel, I'm like, I think this really can't come off of the ban list because, for one thing, of the effect that it has on the entire rest of your deck, Primeval Titan isn't just one card, it's also Field of the Dead. It's also Merit Lage when you get the Thespian Stage and Dark Depths situation going on. Yeah. Primeval Titan is such a toolbox that it radically changes what your own deck is doing. There's not a single landfall in the entire game that doesn't want it. I play a lot of Reanimator, and let me tell you, I cannot wait to cheat and reanimate and blink, that kind of thing. And I think also a kind of a comparison to it is stuff like Dockside, frankly, stuff like Paradox Engine a little bit too. The thing that I have more caution about when it comes to why certain cards are banned, the stuff that launches you forward the most feels to me like the more egregious area of cards that are banned compared to the stuff that limits other players. We see from the SALT scores, we see from the unpopularity of cards like Stasis, that when something just outright limits other players, that to an extent can self-regulate, self-control, whereas as Dana has called it, the hooey factor with cards like Primeval Titan and Paradox Engine, it's harder to control those. It's harder to, like, when something launches you that far forward, it's so exciting. It's hard to do that in a healthy way. And I think that's why that card, I really hope, does not come off the ban list, because I don't think it does produce those healthy states.
But I also think the question is, everything that you just said applies to 99% of the ban list.
Yeah, a lot of the things I said about Primetime also apply to other cards on the ban list. I think that's why those cards are banned.
And so they're all, so again, we're trying to figure out what could be banned, because I mean, if you're looking at Channel or Upheaval, I 100% I would rather have a Primetime, because Channel comes down and it doesn't just propel you forward, but it propels you forward on turn 2. It propels you, like, it does things so much quicker. And Upheaval is just like a complete game reset in so many situations. And if you're the player playing it, then you've reestablished. And again, it goes back to, of all the things it's doing, Primeval Titan is at least doing that in the least damaging way compared to everything else on the ban list.
Sure, though just because it's not as bad as Channel doesn't mean it's not still an issue. I mean, Prophet of Krufix isn't as good as Channel, but that's still a problem card.
Sure.
And so to try and explain my focus here, the reason that I pay the most attention to those launch you far forward best in class category kind of cards is because that is currently the biggest section of the ban list. Let me hit you with some numbers real quick to kind of explain here. As examples, there are 9 cards banned for the barrier to entry criteria, expensive cards like the Moxen. Then there are 3 cards banned for the disappointing twist reason, stuff like Sway the Stars we mentioned earlier, cards that kind of ignore prior gameplay that happened up until that point. Several of the banned categories are in that kind of number range. They don't tend to break double digits. The 2 categories that do are that we have 11 cards on the ban list that lock things down or prevent progress in the game, stuff like limited resources or Caracas, bouncing legendary creatures. Those are the cards that have that feeling of being kind of antithetical to what EDH as a format is trying to accomplish. They're just a unique pain in Commander. But then what really takes the cake is that there are, to my count, 22 cards on the ban list that are banned primarily because of just being really dang good, like the best in class cards, the things that launch you super far forward, stuff like Channel, stuff like Primeval Titan. That's twice as many as the next largest category on the ban list, which is why I put so much of my focus there. The problem of those types of cards isn't just that they're powerful, it's also the effect that they have upon deck building, the effect they have upon future design capabilities, and importantly to me, I also think that super proactive cards are socially more difficult to navigate around than other criteria on the list. A card like Stasis, for example, if people want to play it or if they don't want to play it, that feels like an easier conversation to have, whereas Primeval Titan-esque cards are harder to pin down when you're trying to align game expectations with other players. And the job that I want a ban list to fulfill is to try and make those conversations easier to have.
Right.
So Matt, you're totally right that unbanning Primeval Titan would probably be a crowd pleaser. I bet that they're talking about it a lot. Lord knows that the internet's talking about it a lot too. But the reason I would hesitate to call a card like Primeval Titan safe to unban is because of my focus on that big criteria on the ban list and how cards in that category have a much harder to pin down social effect on healthy deck building and healthy gameplay.
I would say Primeval Titan's biggest sin is probably it's also a time suck.
Yes,
it's people searching up lands.
It shuffles so much,
shuffling, and then back when it was legal, people were running a lot of clone effects, things like that, so they can like get multiple, get it, blink it, clone it, copy it.
Yeah,
and it's not just a time suck into itself, but it's a time suck because oftentimes the best play is to get your prime time out and run a bunch of ways to abuse your prime time, which then makes that many more like plays that soak up time. But like that's why every one of these cards is going to have a downside we can argue about because that's why they're on the ban list in the first place.
Yeah, to me, the place that I think the most concentration needs to be held on the ban list is the stuff that does push that forward. The format currently has Armageddons and stasis effects that are legal, and most of the time people just don't want to play it. Like, I think Upheaval, which you named as well, Upheaval is very abusable, which is why it's a little bit different than some other Armageddon effects, but it's also like, even as a fail state, it's just like, that's boring. But like, stuff that removes is a very different section of the ban list to stuff that just launches you so far forward, that those best in class cards. And
that's
those
where
to me strike me as more dangerous.
See, that's where I think you and I disagree the most, is I would rather have somebody get launched forward and have more resources to do the thing than to take agency and subtract away. That's why if Braids was ever unbanned, where you just sacrifice things all the stinking time, that creates such a miserable game state where it removes agency. That's why I don't like cards like Tergrid. And that's kind of an analogy I've used so many times.
Now, I disagree here. So,
okay,
I would rather see Braids unbanned than Primetime.
Ooh, you get out of here. You get out of here.
For sure, 100%. Because Braids isn't a huge problem necessarily in the 99. And in the command zone, I'll just not play against it.
There it is.
Whereas Primetime is going to show up all the time in a bunch of decks, and I'm going to have to deal with watching not you, but like watch people waste a bunch of time with Primetime. Braids won't affect me because I just probably won't see it. Because I'm like, I'm not going to play your Braids deck. I'm just not interested in doing that.
Sure.
So like, I think there's a few things that are safe bans because they're dodgeable, and Primetime isn't dodgeable, which is why, like, if I was in WotC, I could make an argument for Braids being unbanned because it would self-regulate, like Joey mentioned. It's in the command zone. You could just not play against it.
And that's exactly how I feel as well, Dana. Matt, as you said, you are so much more frustrated by cards that remove agency. But because you're so much more frustrated by them, that's why I think they self-regulate.
Yeah.
Whereas the cards that are harder to have that conversation about, like Primetime, like Dockside was for a very long time, that's why more of my concentration goes on those.
Sure. No, I think that's a very valid way to approach it too. I'm not trying to discount the way that you both approach it. And I think there's a ton of players out there that definitely do the same way. I think, though, too, it also kind of creates the feel bads for the people who want to play it, because then they're going to get in those situations where I built this deck, I want to play it, but nobody wants to play with me.
Sure.
And I'm sure that there's an argument like maybe just be the type of person people want to play with, but also like I can see so much going towards people. It's legal now. They want to build the decks. And now all of a sudden they're being forced to kind of sit there without having the opportunity to do that because the social interactions kind of keep it out. So effectively, like, it doesn't change anything other than create some of those feel bats for people who would want to play that deck.
And Matt, I will actually back that up because that literally just happened to me. I went and played at a shop recently where I don't play very often.
Sure.
And a guy pulled out his Tergrid deck and it's like, can I please play this? No one ever will let me play it. And we played it, and it was miserable because I felt bad. But like that, and it was a miserable time. But it was a miserable time, and we at some point we all just scooped, and it was fine. And we moved on with our game. But like that is a thing that happens. You're 100% correct. Like people would build a Braids and find themselves in a situation, or build a Ryo or whatever it was. That's one other one I had in the list here. Mm-hmm. A mono blue thing that counters everyone's spells. People would build that deck and no one would play against it. And that is a thing that really does occur. People would be bummed out by that.
Yeah. And I think too, that there's play groups out there. I mean, this is the three of us and we kind of we're pretty set in our ways with what we like to experience. I'm sure that there are play groups out there that, again, people who like the playing stacks, like playing those, the puzzle piece types of decks of like, okay, I have this puzzle that I have to solve so I can win. There's a ton of people out there and I want to give them credit and advocate for them a little bit, even though the three of us, we're all pretty anti-stacks here. But I know that there's a lot of players out there, and especially at the higher power level tables, that would want to be able to be doing that.
And that kind of comes to like several of the other cards that are currently banned. The evaluation for me isn't just the effect that they have on an individual game. It's the effect that they have kind of like format wide about like what little subtle things are in the back of your mind when those things are legal in the format. Iona being legal, for instance, even if it wasn't all that popular, I mean, if it became unbanned again, I think it probably would launch up a little bit more. Angel decks have gotten a lot better.
Yeah. 100%.
But it also like that subtly discourages us from playing monocolor decks. And frankly, I prefer a world where we are more encouraged to play monocolor decks. Mm-hmm. Sundering Titan destroys a bunch of basic lands. Well, I'd prefer to live in a world where we're trying to get Dana to play a little bit more of the basic lands, you know, that kind of thing. And to be honest, I think that's why when I see a lot of people talking currently about Coalition Victory potentially coming off the ban list, which is the 5-color spell that could win you the game if you have something of each color and something of each land type, I don't like that. I don't think that is a thing that we want to be concerned about from every single 5-color deck. And more to the point, I think the effect that it has on the game is a bit of a wet fart. It's just like, all right, cool. I guess it's done now. Mm-hmm. People already kind of bristle at the ideas of like combos winning a game seemingly out of nowhere. Some of these cards like Coalition Victory produce exactly that same kind of effect. So it's very weird to see that referenced so much in online conversation as a potentially unbannable card. I think it's provable that people don't enjoy the experience it would actually produce.
Coalition Victory 100% is a card that is not going to come off the ban list. I think that was a pick for people to say it could be unbanned a year or two ago, very, very recently, I think. But the way that WotC has been designing cards lately has definitely kind of put a cap on, could this be unbanned? Cards like Leyline of the Guild Pact make sure that each non-land permanent you control is all colors. So you have a single token out there, any creature, it's all 5 colors. You have Overlord of the Hauntwoods that makes everything lands. All those conditions are suddenly met, and it's fairly easy to pull that off now. Yeah. I don't think that Coalition Victory ever will be unbanned because it puts so much pressure and hampers what the design team is able to do and explore. And because of that, Coalition Victory will never be unbanned.
And even if, like, I don't want us to make the mistake of viewing every single card through the lens of just how powerful those cards are, because probably fair to say that Coalition Victory is not the most powerful version of a win the game effect.
Sure.
You know, there's plenty to be made there, but it has a disappointing effect on the way that we have to evaluate every game, from being like, is my only point of interaction with this like while that spell is on the stack? Because that feels weird. And frankly, that kind of leads me to Biorhythm, which is another one that I've seen a lot of people talking about. Biorhythm, the 8-mana sorcery, each player's life total becomes equal to the number of creatures that they control. I don't personally want to live in a world where after a single Wrath, people could just be accidentally oopsed out of the game. That change, like a Biorhythm looming over every game, changes the way that we play the game. And so it just not being legal is just like, thank goodness I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to negotiate that every game. Seems like a healthier way to approach the deck building stage, not even the playing stage of the game.
My argument for Biorhythm, and again, this isn't necessarily an argument like for me personally so much as if I was on the team and I had to come up with a couple cards. I think I could argue for Biorhythm. Because I don't know if it's that different from Craterhoof in terms of you cast it and you just kind of win the game with the Craterhoof, and Biorhythm kind of does the same thing. Yes, there's situations like you said where like you can set it up with a Wrath and then cast Biorhythm. Okay, but if you have 14 mana to do a thing, you're probably gonna win the game anyway.
That's 14 mana worth of cards, yeah.
Well, if I may interrupt, Biorhythm wins you the game off of someone else's Wrath too. it could end the game in a draw. It's not just your Wrath. The effect that it has whenever you don't have a creature in play is the thing that I'm worried about. Not about someone abusing Biorhythm.
Sure.
So much as just like, all right, if I'm now never really able to play a deck that has no creatures in play at any time, and I always live in fear whenever any Wrath happens ever.
Sure. But would people, I guess that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that aspect. Would people run it on the off as defense against a Wrath? And maybe, I guess I hadn't really thought about that angle of it. Sure, that's fair.
I think that's pretty corner casey though. I
wouldn't run it in that case, but like I could see that being a conceivable thing, I guess.
Yeah, I think the people that are playing it, like they're intending to win, and they're probably planning on building decks that are going to be able to cast Biorhythm at any point in time. And therefore, like if they're going to cast it after a board wipe, they're going to have some way to make sure it's not just a straight up draw. Because otherwise, like cards like Divine Intervention, which literally makes the game end in a draw, that card isn't played at all. Granted, I mean, it's also an expensive card, but I think Biorhythm is a significantly healthier way to suddenly end the game because of that. And again, it could backfire. And I don't see a lot of players out there willingly stepping into a card that's going to backfire and not let them win, except unless they're like the weird people who really like the moral victory about that with Divine Intervention, one of which I played with for a long time, and he knows who he is. So I've played with those people. I also don't think that they're playing Biorhythm with the intent of letting the game end in a draw. They're going to find ways to make sure it's a win.
The fact that it can accidentally knock people out is more of the thing. And to again just talk about the practical application here, a single 8-mana spell wiping out over 100 life points from the game, that doesn't strike me as a good place to be.
Sure.
While 8 mana does produce, Dana, you mentioned the Crater Hoof example, I don't know that that comparison is as strong as it initially sounds. Biorhythm can only be interacted with while it's on the stack, whereas Crater Hoof can be interacted with on the stack. It also requires you to move to combat. Combat can be fogged. It has to interact with, let's say, an opponent has a Sphere of Safety effect in play. Those are many more points of interaction than just, I cast a Biorhythm and someone happens to have 0 creatures in play. A Biorhythm effect currently exists in the current format, and it's in the creature on Shaman of Forgotten Ways, but that is a creature that people can remove. It's a creature that has summoning sickness. It's a creature that requires you to tap it. There are many points of interaction beyond just when the spell is on the stack. Like, Matt, even the Divine Intervention example, that takes several turns before the effect triggers. That you see it coming. And an enchantment that's slowly ticking down is a very different experience to a spell that was just cast. If Coalition Victory wasn't a sorcery, if that was an enchantment that said at the beginning of your upkeep, if these conditions are true, you win the game, I doubt even that would be banned, because the interaction points are significantly deeper to the effect of just a sorcery.
For sure.
That is, to me, a pretty big distinction, as well as the effect that they would have on what is looming over the game. There's a difference to me when I'm, encountering a green player. It's just like, all right, I need to be aware of a Crater Hoof versus I need to make sure I always have at least one creature in play. Those are both things that could be looming over your head all game, but they affect you as a deck builder in very, very different ways, even during the deck building stage.
Because we really don't want any of these cards unbanned. And we understand why they're on the list in the first place.
That's true. Yes.
If we had to pick one again, we're in a really specific.
We're not saying they should, because I think the three of us all agree the ban list is there for a reason. The cards got on there for a reason. We're just trying to say, if we're in Wizards of the Coast mind and we had to make a decision, what would that be? And so I get the thought exercise.
Although, considering the time right now, actually, it might be best to address those distinctions after challenging some stats.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition right there. Nice job, Joey.
Seems about that time.
Well, I'll get it started real quick then. So Jackson Oatley sent us an email, which anyone out there can do, EDHRECast@gmail.com, and had a really good challenge for a commander that is, you might say, near and dear to my heart. So Jackson opens up and says, hey friends, I love listening to the podcast. I have a good challenge for you. While brewing a Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck, I came across the card Kindred Boon, and it's played in only 77 Kyler decks at the time of writing. So Kyler Sigardian Emissary, one of my favorite commanders. It's the Selesnya humans that pumps up all of your humans for every counter that's on Kyler. That's the big deal. And then whenever humans come into the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter onto Kyler. The important distinction, and this is kind of in line with some other challenges I've done on Kyler before, is that Kyler buffs up your humans for every counter, not every +1/+1 counter. So Kindred Boon is 2 white for an enchantment that says, as Kindred Boon enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Then you can pay 1 and a white to put a divinity counter on target creature you control of the chosen type. And then each creature you control with a divinity counter on it has indestructible. This comes out that you can pay 1 and a white to put a divinity counter onto Kyler, therefore making Kyler indestructible. This also, though, because of the way that Kyler is worded, also gives +1/+1 to all of your humans because it is a divinity counter, therefore counts towards Kyler's ability to pump up all your creatures. This is super, super good. This is a catch because not only is it you pay 2 mana to put a counter onto a creature, you can do it at instant speed. So say you want to put 6 mana worth of counters onto Kyler, you can do that as a combat trick even. You can do that to pump up the team so it's 2 mana to give a permanent +1/+1 to the rest of your humans, and just making it even harder and harder. Mega indestructible, I think, is the exact mechanic that WotC would print for this. But it's such a cool use case for Kindred Boon. It's only in 11,000 decks total right now, and only 77 of Kyler decks. So this is a really good catch, Jackson. Thank you for your email, and thank you for the solid challenge.
Big agree. I don't think Kindred Boon is, in general, a great card for a bunch of Kindred decks, but Kyler's an exception. Mid-combat, combat trick, suddenly an extra anthem, that is a good use for Kindred Boon. And a lot of other places that think it might be too slow, there it protects your very valuable commander and does extra pump. It's doing double duty. That's really cool.
It's doing a lot. It's a great challenge. Thank you, Jackson, for this.
I'll move to my challenge here now, and this is a challenge for the new commander, Marina Vendrell from Duskborn. I've been really interested in Marina. She's the 5-color commander that gets you a bunch of enchantments. That ETB effect is way too powerful, but also can unlock your rooms or relock your rooms just by tapping her, which is a really, really interesting effect. But if you are building this deck completely based around that new room mechanic where you cast 1/2 of the enchantment and you can unlock the other half of it a little bit later, later, there are some interesting rules applications to be aware of when it comes to those rooms, and that's why I'm going to challenge the card Undo Spirit Dancer as being potentially overplayed in all of the 2,400-ish Marina Vendrell decks that we've gotten since Duskmourn's release. Undo Spirit Dancer is the 5-mana 3/3 core cleric that says whenever an enchantment you control enters, you may create a token that is a copy of it. You do this only once each turn. It's currently showing up in a little over a third of all of the new Marina Vendrell decks that we've got in the EDHREC database. The thing is, rooms being copied doesn't produce a great effect here. There's the difference between what a room will do if you copy that room spell while it's on the stack versus making a copy of it once it's already on the battlefield. A copy of a room that is already on the battlefield will enter with the entire thing fully locked. Or if you resurrect any of your enchantments from the graveyard right to the battlefield, they will also, in that case, enter fully locked. So with Undo Spirit Dancer, you will be getting more rooms, but they will be entering with the doors fully closed, which means you will have to pay extra mana or use a lot more Marina stuff to unlock them in the first place. And in that case, I'd rather just put some stuff that untaps Marina so that you can use her ability multiple times on the same rooms if you wanted to copy those abilities anyhow. So Undo Spirit Dancer, it's a really cute card, but I don't think this is the enchantment deck for that one. I would call it overplayed for Marina Vendrell.
And last but not least here, we have a card from Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed is a set I think a lot of people missed out on. Number one, it wasn't a full set. It was kind of a little mini-ish set, and I think it flew under the radar, but there's a lot of really decent cards in there. And the one I want to challenge the stats on this week is the card Eagle Vision. It's a sorcery for 4 and a blue, and it says draw 3 cards, which is a pretty terrible rate. However, it has free running. And I think people sometimes also miss that free running works with your commander. You may cast this spell for its free running cost if you dealt combat damage to a player this turn with an assassin or a commander. And there are, in the game right now, legally, about 200 blue commanders that have flying, and that's before we get into the couple that have various landwalk abilities or things like horsemanship or whatever to make them punch through and deal damage consistently. Free running for 1 and a blue, drawing 3 cards for that rate is ridiculously efficient. And if you are playing a blue commander that has some form of evasion, you should be running Eagle Vision. It's only in about 9,000 decks right now. That's just one of the best rated draw spells out there if you are in a deck that consistently casts it for its free running cost, and it should see more play. That's just a really efficient way to get 3 cards into your hand.
Yeah, free running counting your commanders is a little bit ludicrous. I don't think that it needed that extra stuff. It would have been flavorful without it.
Yeah, I think people just missed that. They just assume it's Assassins only, and I think they just missed that part.
Okay, fellas, so kind of recentering the conversation, and because again, I want us to make sure that we're clear about, like, there's not a thing that we're necessarily personally advocating for so much as, like, what Wizards itself could do. A thing I also want to explore here, like, if we're talking about reevaluate the ban list, if everything is on the table, I think it's also fair to bring up the question of, like, is there a world in which Wizards of the Coast brings back things that are just banned as a commander rather than just a single ban list? I'm not sure how you guys feel. Like, what is your immediate reaction when you hear that floated as an idea if you're on this Wizards panel?
I saw that note in our show notes, and I immediately, like, my stomach churned a little bit because I don't think they need to add more things for players to have to track. Sure. And adding a banned as commander versus banned, that's going to create so much confusion. Again, I know that I talk about newer players a lot in this conversation, but I also think they're the ones who benefit the most from the structure and the rules being in place, and complicating things for newer players, having separate ban lists that they have to track. I can see why they would at least, like, float the idea. Okay. And they're kind of doing their due diligence in the offices for Wizards of the Coast. I don't think they should bring back banned as commander. I think it's just, the card is banned, it's gone, and that's all you need to worry about.
I think players can handle banned as commander. I don't disagree with you, Matt, but I think we would be fine if they rescinded. I think players would learn it pretty quickly. My issue with it is I just don't think it adds very much. Like,
that too.
You could do that and players could handle it just so someone could put Braids in their deck or someone could put Urayo in their deck. Mm-hmm. Does that give us very much? Okay, yeah, we could, in the same token, remove Lutri and say Lutri just can't be used as a commander and you can put it in your deck. All right, well, those all seem really inconsequential additions to the game to justify making a rule change. So while I think it would be fine to do, I also, like, it also feels like, why bother, to me at least.
Yeah. The Josh Lee Kwai adage of the juice isn't worth the squeeze, I think that 100% applies to this potential change.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that very much. For the record, once again, I'm not saying I am advocating for this. I do think it is a potential thing on the table there, because I think it would be a crowd pleaser. I think like fair. If there is indeed like they want to make a couple of unbans, I think that them saying that, oh, Lutri is just banned as commander/companion versus like now you can actually play your nice friendly looking otter, that strikes me as a crowd pleasing move. Matt, I totally agree with you that like information moves slowly. There are a lot of people who still currently think that banned as a commander is still currently a thing, and it hasn't been for years. Information does move slowly. But to that, I think that Wizards of the Coast ability to communicate with players is very different than the rules committee's ability to communicate with players. So I think it is potentially more of a viable option now because of the communication abilities that Wizards as a company actually has to reach more players and to inform them about a difference in there. Previously everything moved so slowly that I don't think it was ever realistic. Now I think there's a little bit more of a realistic thing there. And I think them releasing like, yes, there are more things that can go into your deck, more Goloses for your 99, more Lutris for your 99, but certain things are still off limits in the command zone. That does actually open up a couple more cards to be played in Commander. And if Commander is supposed to be the format where you can play a whole lot of cards that you can't play anywhere else, having those distinctions between banned as commander/companion, but they're not banned in the 99, that is a thing that I think could go over in a crowd-pleasing way that also allows them to make some other unbans that I think would overall end up going in a PR way pretty well in the short term.
But I think, like you just specified, though, in the short term, that's a short-term gain that I don't know really benefits or potentially hamstrings them more in the long run. Yeah. And I don't see them doing that.
Now, I would say while it might not gain anything in the short term, I guess potentially does that open up a few design venues where like, okay, well, we wouldn't want to have built this particular card. Now, I don't know what that would be, but like we wouldn't want to make this card in the command zone. But if we could make it banned as commander, then maybe we would print it. Maybe it does open up a few things that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. So potentially it's got some future advantages. I'm not really sure there, but I could see that.
I mean, we've already kind of seen some cards like that, like the command, not command tower, but the card that moves the commander from the command zone to your hand.
Sure.
Command beacon.
Yeah.
Command beacon. Yes, thank you. We've seen cards like command beacon already kind of play a little bit of that. And it kind of weakens cards, and not that they need to be weakened or let be strong anymore, like Drannith Magistrate, but there are already kind of ways they've been playing around that. And we've seen what happens when they move things out of the command zone, but you get cards like Prosh, I guess, where they want to be maneuvered around a little bit, cards like Derevi. And so encouraging that type of design space where, we want this, but we don't want it in the command zone, I don't know if that's a healthy design space for them to explore.
I agree it wouldn't necessarily be a healthy design space for them to explore. But if you've got, corporate overlords breathing down your neck a little bit and they're like, let's just make more money. And this is more design space technically that could be played in. I'm just saying that possibility exists. And if we are going, back to the drawing board when it comes to the ban list, that's a question to me that I think rings pretty loudly in the room in terms of is there a reason to bring that back? I hope not. But I think that there is more justification for it than there was before when it was an independent rules body compared to Wizards actually being able to communicate these types of slightly more complicated changes with players.
Yeah, I wager that the closest they ever even get is a point system. And I think Canadian Highlander kind of does a good job with that, where these cards are technically legal. They just occupy a huge amount of points on your deck. But even then, I just don't see these ever coming back for just a multitude of reasons.
Yeah, very fair. And a point system like the one that Canadian Highlander uses, that's definitely something to mention real quick. Like if we're saying that everything's on the table, then that, I guess, gets reevaluated as well. Although I guess the reason we didn't bring it up until now is because Wizards said on their announcement stream that they don't want to do a point system already. It's an interesting system. It's an interesting puzzle for deck builders in the Canadian Highlander format, but it seems Wizards isn't interested in it. Gavin mentions, I think, that he worries about people trying to game that type of system in the Commander format. I believe he said that, although for the the record, I would have a similar worry about gaming the bracket system that they've proposed, but I don't know. That's early days yet. Like, the jury's obviously still out on that. But anyway, Matt, yeah, I ultimately agree with you. I don't see either of those things making a return. I just imagine that they are some of the things that are getting re-examined in boardrooms right now, because when there's new format leadership involved, suddenly every option is back on the table to reaffirm those choices and whether they'll stay.
So are there any cards then, if we're talking crowd pleasing, let's talk about the opposite of that? Are there any other cards that you guys like have in your personal, I wouldn't mind actually seeing this get banned?
I mean, they've said that they are not planning on making bans anytime soon, which is nice to hear. That's good. But yeah, if you're talking about a personal watch list, Dana, I think you and I both named some pretty expensive cards earlier, and so like I don't understand why Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale is legal if some of the other cards aren't.
Right.
I'm not saying that like it needs to go or anything like that, but in terms of like making things consistent, that could be one.
This is also the category, I think, where there's the most weird inconsistencies, at least viewed through the lens of today. Take Bazaar of Baghdad, which is from the same set as Library of Alexandria, and I would argue probably more powerful of a card, generally speaking, than Library is. But Library is banned and Bazaar isn't, and that's because at the time, Library was a much more expensive card than Bazaar was. Nowadays, they're pretty equal in price. Could they then, ban Bazaar? Sure, the rules committee could have banned it at any point in the last several years, but there's like 10,000 Bazaars in existence. Yeah, they could, but does that impact anything? We've seen over the years, even the most benign bans tend to generate a whole lot of heat, let alone controversial ones. So if the cards are so rare they are not seeing play, like in the case of Bazaar, or they're so rare they wouldn't see play if they were unbanned, like Library, then what's the point of even dealing with it? So there's a lot of weird things here. Time Twister, for example. It's the one member of the Power 9 that is legal in Commander, because at the time it wasn't crazy expensive like the rest of them. It is today. Could they ban it for those reasons? Sure. Would it impact anything for the average player? Not really. So why go through the heat of making people angry by banning it? Yeah, Library of Alexandria, Tabernacle, and Bazaar should all either be legal or all either be banned. There shouldn't be one that's legal or two that's legal and one that isn't. But again, it's like, doesn't matter. It impacts nothing. But I absolutely understand the inconsistency.
I think over time, the things that my eyes keep falling on are the cards that cause subtle social frictions. So I think I'll use Expropriate as my example here, even though that's a 9-mana card. 9 mana is not very subtle. I don't think Expropriate needs a ban, but it does feel like if any card is going to get people accusing each other of stuff, I think it's that one. When that card is played, when it's cast, players often feel the need to start quarterbacking each other's decisions. Like, weirdly, you end up being more annoyed at the person who says, I vote time, than you are with the person who casts the Expropriate in the first place. Just giving someone else an extra turn, it instills that weird feeling of powerlessness. Stuff like that has aspects that feel a little bit like trade secrets in that way, where it's like, oh, those other two players can make sure that I'm just not a part of this game, I guess. It just sometimes is a card that makes something happen between players that feels a little icky. I don't think I can actually justify a ban for it. Like, plenty of other big extra turn spells exist. I just think that effect can have that type of social souring on the game that happens above the board itself rather than on the battlefield. And that's the kind of thing that I don't necessarily care for in card games and in board games. But ultimately, though, I subscribe to wanting a smaller ban list overall. I think there are so many examples of troublesome cards that simply belong to too big of a category for any individual member of those categories to get banned. As an obvious example, there are dozens of mass land destruction cards and plenty of other cards that keep resources from untapping, for instance. But you can't ban one of those cards without it then feeling weird that the others are legal.
Sure.
And it's also not wise to ban all of them and then make the ban list swell to 200% bigger than it currently is. At a certain size, a ban list is just too hard to keep tabs on. But anyway, at the end of the day, there are about 29,000 unique cards in the format, and only 49 of them are currently banned. If you need something to play, there are lots of options. I've mentioned before that I think the more obvious or egregious cards are so obvious that they self-regulate. So that's just why the cards that I try to pay attention to are the ones that could cause awkward social frictions, because I think it's the kind of thing that players, especially newer players, have a hard time defending against.
Yeah, I get why folks would want to keep the ban list small, especially for those who they have their own established playgroup and they want to be able to carry over those decks as much as possible. And so if you have that healthy playgroup, yeah, a smaller ban list just means you don't have to make any changes from your house playgroup to a Magic Con, for example. So like Josh Lee Kwai, I get his stance on that. My big say, I guess, and feedback on if we had to have a personal watch list, anybody who's listened to this episode more than like 3 episodes knows like the antisocial cards, the cards like Turgid, the newest edition, Maha at Feathers at Night, I think is kind of a really negative play experience for so many because of 2 card combos with so many different cards out there that you can put in the 99. And so just socially, again, to Dana's point that you had, we can opt out of those games. We can just say, I don't want to play with that commander. But again, sometimes players can't help themselves, and we're just getting a density of those cards. I also think Drannith Magistrate, like I just advocated for a little bit, I guess. I also wouldn't hate seeing that just because, again, cards that remove players' agency, I think in the wild, not at your local play group, not at your established people that you play with every week, in the wild, it's just so hard to navigate a lot of those situations with Drannith Magistrate, with a lot of antisocial cards like that. I wouldn't miss it at all, but I also, again, the more that I've been thinking of these past few weeks, the more I'm thinking, honestly, like a smaller ban list isn't necessarily the worst thing because it's just you're giving players options and you can kind of curate your local play group to that type of experience that you want.
To your point on the Drannith, I think Drannith is exactly the kind of card that Wizards could make a justification for banning in the future as well, because there are ways that it feels ulterior to what Commander is there to do.
100%.
So I wouldn't be surprised if that one ends up getting floated in whatever potential future conversations they have as well.
Yeah.
I would be perfectly okay if I was never asked, did you pay the 1 over the course of the rest of my EDH career?
Wow, really?
I don't think Rhystic Study is breaking games. I don't think it's necessarily a holistic problem, but I think it does a bunch of it does a bunch of things that are bannable. It's ubiquitous. Like there's no deck that runs blue that isn't better with a Rhystic Study. Like that's just flat out true. It does kind of suck up time. It's kind of annoying, and it's one where players don't really have a lot of self-control. Particularly the last few years, I've seen it show up it's in a lot of casual decks as well as like high power ones. So while it's not a problem, it hits a bunch of those things, even if it doesn't like hit them particularly loudly. It sounds a whole bunch of bells, and I would be perfectly okay with seeing that removed from the annals of Commander.
Yeah, it's not an anti-social card, but it happens to be too social because you're always asking people, do you want to pay? It's like that friend who like you can't get to shut up. You like them, but you just can't get them to stop talking when you're trying to leave the party.
I'm right here, Matt.
Listen, my mom is the same way. I can't call my mom and not talk to her for less than 45 minutes. Even though it's just say, hey, did you get that thing in the mail?
Yeah. No, I get that feeling. I think that Charlotte Sable, who was on the Commander Advisor group, also said that Rhystic Study had been on her watch list for a really, really long time as well. I don't personally feel that strongly about Rhystic, but Dana, I also understand why you are annoyed at being continually asked. It isn't the kind of card that I foresee being like, that is a card that like, they can put into a whole lot of sets to sell a whole lot of packs. So I don't know that it...
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. It wouldn't strike me as a...
I mean, Expropriate's kind of the same way in that vein too.
Fair. Sure. Yeah. That's very, very fair. Yeah. That's more of a personal one where I'm just like, this causes a weird social friction. And I think the social friction is really the thing that I want to focus on.
Yeah.
A lot of times when people look at the ban list and notice that like, pieces of this are kind of inconsistent. Like even like Sol Ring being used as a constant like thing in a lot of ban discussions. Sol Ring's the mascot of the format. It's not going anywhere. But people look at Sol Ring being ubiquitous and super powerful, and then compare that to a bunch of the other things that are banned.
Sure.
And it again just has to kind of come down to that, like, it's the vibes. It's a vibes check. Sol Ring is a mascot of the format situation, but some of these other cards, they create an experience that isn't as much fun on the vibes. They harsh the buzz in the room, or they affect games in a way that just aren't going to be, I guess, crowd pleasing. You're going to walk away from those games feeling a little bit disappointed, is the thing that they want the ban list to avoid. Mm-hmm. And I hope that maintains itself as a core, a mission statement for what the ban list will still be.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways they can take this. And I just, the more that I look at it, the cards that I think routinely have a potential to become unbanned are ones that don't potentially impact future design.
Yeah.
That's this kind of thing that I look for when I'm looking at the ban list for myself is, if they were to unban cards, how would this impact future design? I think that's a question they're going to be asking. And that's how kind of they're going to have to use as a rubric for, could we unban this because it's going to impact what we are allowed to do in the future?
to double down on your point there, that's actually one of the things that has me a little bit more afraid of like the Primeval Titan as a potential discussion.
Sure. Yeah.
That being legal affects every single non-basic land that they print in the entire rest of the game, because Primeval Titan will be able to just go and get those.
Yep.
Compared to other cards that strike me as potentially safer to unban, like Sway of the Stars, it wouldn't compromise any future design problems in the way that some of the other cards currently on the ban list would.
Yeah.
To be honest, guys, I think the real question is whether they're going to unban all of the silver bordered cards in Commander.
Get out of here, you troll. You're not even just a troll, you're just a trollop for even asking that question. How dare you? I thought we were friends, Joey.
We are.
Oh my gosh.
But like, let's be honest, that is the kind of thing that we do have to be like more aware of than we were before, right? Like Wizards has pushed stuff about like, oh, they wanted planeswalkers to be legal as commanders for a little while, and they really enjoyed the silver bordered sets. We saw them do a whole Unfinity trying to get people to buy more of the silver bordered stuff by removing the silver borders. So no, it was a troll question, but that is the kind of stuff that like lingers in my mind. I think again, a lot of this conversation comes down to what are the things that they can make better use of. I've mentioned the smokescreen thing before. I think that some cards will end up being unbanned so that they can also justify unbanning some of the cards that were recently banned, so that way they can maintain some of that reprint equity. But I think there are also other conversations that will be had about like, what does the state of the ban list currently accomplish, and will it be changed in any way to help accomplish other things in the future, such as banning as commander or other stuff like that? Are there things that they as Wizards can do that an independent rules committee body couldn't do before? It's a thing that's on my mind is all.
You had me feeling good, Joey, and now I'm like wondering if I'm going to have to worry about losing games because I couldn't yodel loud enough or whatever cards make you do.
Well, and it should be mentioned too that like that was something that the rules committee was working on before, was the silver border project too. So yes, I immediately did not like that question that you asked, Joey, but it is something that I think the Wizards of the Coast would like to eventually see. That otherwise, like you said, they wouldn't have moved silver border to black border with the acorn stamp that nobody can tell what it is. But I hope it doesn't happen, because like I don't want to have to bring a Nerf gun to every Magic game that I've ever played before.
Right.
Or like go play laser tag and whoever wins gets to deal 5 damage to target creature. Like those aren't the types of games that I'm interested in. I know there are a lot of people out there, friends of mine love unsets. I am glad that they can play and I don't have to participate. That is something that I would just hard nope out of.
I think it's fair to say that those fall into the manual dexterity category that we went over earlier.
Sure.
That is kind of where a lot of the silver bordered or acorn symbol cards currently exist, is in that section of the ban list. And I don't know, like going over those different categories, those groupings of why certain cards are banned, those are interesting to explore. And it's interesting to me to see which of those categories has the greatest number of cards in them, because sometimes it isn't just about like how powerful stuff is. It really can come down to whether they've reduced deck diversity. You know, that was this justification for Golos.
Yeah.
Do they produce an ending to the game that everyone finds a little bit disappointing? And that's the situation that was going for like Coalition Victory and such like that. So like spending time ruminating on those groupings is kind of where I'm at, and I'm wondering whether Wizards feels the same about them.
Yeah, I mean, but now that you say that, like I don't even think Golos is necessarily off the table when it comes to unbanning, because like we just mentioned, you know, cards that will limit what they can do design wise, that's just competing because it was just the de facto best thing. That just means that they have more incentive to print more powerful 5-color commanders. And I mean, you have like the Kenriths already, you have all these other 5-color commanders since Golos was even banned. And so maybe by now, like Golos wouldn't even be bad. Correction, it still would be bad. Maybe it wouldn't be that bad anymore.
We just have to make sure that we don't only view the list through the lens of power level, because I don't think that Wizards will be, and I don't think we ought to either, because there are a lot of other things that go into regulating the social format. But it does start with one thing. We all know when we sit down that we're not going to have to negotiate. So are you playing with a Black Lotus?
Right.
And thank goodness that we don't have to mitigate that every single time. Y'all, there's a lot here. I definitely want to hear from our listeners what cards are on their personal watch lists or what they predict will happen in the future. I'm very intrigued to see what they think might be going on. There's been a lot of discussion about this. I think that means for now, though, that we're going to call this episode to a close. So, fellas, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, where is it that they can find you online to talk about all of their ban or unban opinions?
Well, you can find me at pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you need to protect all these banned cards that you're just going to display behind you, like I happen to do with that one ring that may not last, it is in an Ultimate Guard sleeve. It is protected. Make sure you get Ultimate Guard to protect all of your valuable cards out there, no matter if they're legal or not.
And you can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And you'll also find all of us at MagicCon Vegas coming up here in just a week or so.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me online everywhere at Joseph M. Schultz. And if you want to get in touch with the cast, you can find us everywhere online at EDHRECast. And if you want to send us an email, maybe with a challenge the stats submission, for instance, you can find us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.